Hello, listeners, and welcome back to the sixth and final core theme to be explored as part of this wilderness journey. This episode is called Being Part of the Whole and Seeing Through the Veil. It is perhaps the most challenging of the core themes to speak to, as it alludes to glimpses and experiences that stir us from our usual patterns of life and thinking and calls us towards a different level of wakefulness. One whispering of an interconnected world and influencing how we see ourselves, everything around us, and our part in it. Such moments are sometimes easy to brush past and not easy to put words to. And so the primal intention of this podcast is to explicitly welcome them, to acknowledge them, and to speak to them as well as we can, positioning them as natural and real experiences invoked by our willingness to take the wilderness experience. To do full service to this topic, Adrian has invited Ann Walsh to join him in this conversation. Ann has worked in the field of personal and professional development for 25 years, initially training in psychology and practice as a psychotherapist. Alongside this practice, she was the operations director of a psychological training and development institute, training people in coaching, psychotherapy, and counseling. In the last 10 years, she has specialized in executive coaching, training, and supervision and has worked with clients across the globe. So, without further delay, let's go to Ann and Adrian and let them speak to the purpose of this podcast for the listener and where it fits in this wilderness journey.
So thanks, Mattison, and welcome to Ann Walsh. I'm really delighted, Ann, that you can join us today. I know you're a very experienced practitioner in supporting the development of others, and you have a particular specialism, not just in personal development, but in the transpersonal fields. And this is what this core theme is touching on today. So welcome, Ann. And would you say a few words to the listener?
Yes, I want to say hello to the listeners, and I'm delighted to be able to walk along this wilderness path for a short way with you on this podcast. It feels a really important piece in line with all the other work that you've been doing. So I'm hoping that my learnings and experiences will also resonate with your experiences. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you, Ann. And so let's begin. So we're thinking about the purpose of the podcast and how it fits into the wilderness journey. What thoughts do you have on purpose, Ann?
The purpose for this podcast, it seems, is to normalize something that can initially be quite surprising, or we can become resistant to it because we really don't understand what's happening. So I think to have people walking alongside you who've taken the path and experienced these special moments can be really useful. So the purpose of the podcast at one level is to make something that can feel quite extraordinary, ordinary, and able to bring it down onto the pavement of our lives. So that's what I see as the purpose of this podcast.
Thank you, Ann. And on the pavement as well, I think it takes an open mind, a receptive mind to welcome this topic. And so my invitation is about for the listener to find a quiet place of receptivity, openness, and listening, and to engage with this material and wonder what it might mean for you. I've been reflecting on some questions. What do you know of these glimpses of something more that give this sense of being a part of the whole? Have you noticed these experiences for yourself, and how do these experiences resonate with you? What are they offering us, and what might we receive from them? And what do they ask of us? So real, quite challenging questions, but the essence of this is opening to the full possibility of this core theme and topic.
And from my experience, it can take courage to respond, because initially we may respond in the way that isn't what it's really about. And I was thinking about that today, actually, when I was getting ready for the podcast, that sometimes we can have processes that begin that can feel quite disturbing initially. we can have a sense of a loss of interest or a loss of meaning or some confusion about what do I really want here. And of course, when we have these awakening experiences, it's taking the time to listen and ask the sort of questions that you're asking, Adrian, to make sure you're responding to the experience in the appropriate way for you.
So, Anne, you're highlighting the fact that they can be destabilizing and disturbing, and they can also be brushed past quite easily as well.
Yes, we can waken up to them, which means having the courage to take responsibility and to be accountable for the impact they've had, and or we can try and go back to sleep, which in some ways can feel initially easier. But I think if we don't respond to them, they will return. I think it's something of our life's journey that we're being offered the opportunity to awaken many, many times over the course of our lives.
And I think, Anne, there's a for what question there, awaken for what? And I want to say just a word or two about the wilderness journey and why this core theme is in there. For me, the wilderness question that is present with this topic is where lies lasting happiness, fulfillment, peace, and freedom. And the wilderness path for me is taken as a whole, a journey that begins with a sense of fragmentation. Essentially, when I was on the path, I felt isolated, alone, set apart. But the journey is a journey towards becoming whole. And it's whole within ourselves, whole within myself, and being all that I can be, and also whole within the greater world and system, which we are an intrinsic part. And so the for what question is, well, it's about finding ourselves, finding our place, and it's about belonging and home. When I think about the path as a whole, the pattern beneath it is one of learning to look more perceptively around me, within me, and becoming aware. And this is all part of this process. We're offering this proposition of a broader reality beyond the normal waking consciousness, a reality that underlies and underpins all life. We're all an expression of that. When I was writing, I used to describe it as we are each a bead on the continuous thread of the living. This is a very challenging idea, and yet it can offer us these experiences away from alienation and fragmentation towards wholeness.
If you're someone who naturally comes from a place of humility and sometimes maybe has a sense of, well, where do I fit? Do I matter? This idea that we actually can make a difference in the world by surrendering to recognizing that we are part of a greater whole can be quite a journey to go on. I think, first of all, we need to begin to explore what it means for us individually. And over time, I think that we begin to recognize that as I work on myself, as I really begin to explore my own wilderness journey, it is having a ripple effect on how I see others, see the world around me, and look to what really matters for people in life.
Well, it brings up a question I'd like to ask you, Anne. So what does being a part of the whole then evoke in you, that phrase and that core theme?
For me, initially, and it's interesting, even as you say it to me, Adrian, I can feel a little glitch in my tummy, a little bit of fear, as though my own individuality might get lost. So there is a slight fear. But if I can sit back and just breathe a moment and trust the journey so far, I can see that the initial awakening that I think I experienced has led to how I've led the next 40 years of my life. At the time, I could not have known that. but it has definitely directed my journey for the next 40 years of my life.
And we'll come on to that, Anne. And so this feeling, this glitch in your stomach, is a sense of fear, and I can relate to that as well, because in this journey and in this experience of being a part of a whole, there are fears of losing yourself, submitting, and loss of control. Even I'm with you entirely in saying, please take the journey and experience this. For me, what does this evoke? It's a different beginning, actually, because as a twin, my first experience in very early childhood was a world full of captivating allure and enchantment, and this sense of being intrinsically part of a world and others was part of my child's mind. I was full of wonder and awe. And so the very first thing that comes to me is that childhood imprint. Of course, it leaves as we individuate and things move on, and the childhood mind becomes tidied up in many ways, as mine was. But the first thing that the topic takes me back to is that. What it leaves me with, though, is a sense of faith, belief, and trust. Somehow, from these glimpses, and my experience in the wilderness work is these came in glimpses and moments. They have an eternal touch. And what they've left is almost like an open part of me, a valency towards this experience, this sense of becoming more a part of a whole, sense of feeling held, feeling sometimes guided, feeling intrinsically interwoven into something. That's my experience. But I agree, Anne, there is always the anxiety piece as well. It would be good to come on to talking about an actual peak experience. And the way we're going to do this is to share a piece of evocative writing, A World Unto Itself. Do you have anything to say about this piece before we offer it to the listener?
Well, I have listened to it, and I think it's an exquisitely beautiful piece. And just to reassure the listener that their experiences may be different, but they're equally valid. So we'll all meet these times or meet these experiences in different ways, depending on our own soul's journey. Because my journey, as you described yours, Adrian, was very different. My journey was about survival and being alone and having to be extremely independent, which meant that it was difficult for me to really open and to appreciate what you're bringing in this beautiful video.
And I love the fact that we can both enter the space from different places. And I think this is the reiteration of this fact, and the awakening moments that expand our awareness, come in many different places. And to the point of this piece, I was in a place of retreat and escape and getting away from the daily stage show of I'm fine. And I was really struggling to find answers when this moment came. And it was a precious moment for me when the world was thrown open and I experienced everything differently. And I don't want to say more about that, but what I do want to say is it wasn't an easy piece to include, because it is one of the few of my pieces that's written in the first person. And there's something about a sense of exposure in sharing such an intimate and personal experience. It can be perceived as grandiose, or it can be perceived in other ways. And what I wanted to say was my intention with the piece, you probably know this of me, was simply to try and capture something that was emerging and that was coming into being. And it was such an experience that it was like painting. It was like painting with a palette of paints. I never thought about the words were just written. So we'll share that piece with you now.
A world unto itself. I was longing for a cool drink. Being on the western side of Langkawi Island, I had many choices of openings into the rainforest where the clusters of hotels suckle. This forest was dense and thick, sustaining a wealth of nesting tangled foliage. It was also very Malaysian in the way that every leaf has a seed, a gaudy berry, or overpoweringly scented flower. Here was an evocative kingdom spreading out, owning the sky, with not the slightest semblance of order or compliance. It was a kind of natural defiance, a rebellion, all of which I found glorious. I was restless and unable to settle. We are all plants without a rest from the seasons. I wanted to find my place, cure this mind racing. I was well absorbed into this tight, pressing world of me. I needed sorting again. I needed some relief, and I was tired out from fiddling with my human circuitry, trying to find a release button. Here I was, trying to find an escape from this human soup of disappointment, desolation, and intrinsic loneliness. Through my daily work, I had served my pound of flesh with a kind of consent, and at the same time had been quietly crushed by the prolonged effort, yet unable to deny my part. I had come away to gather myself up, yet I knew in some fundamental sense that the cure must come from me, the traveller, not the destination. Driven only by heat and my thirst, I diverted my car into the very next turning on what had been a long road, settling for anything. Without answers, I had taken the escapist's route, retreating alone only to loot what was left of my reason, try and overturn some grain of truth in this thick scrub and undergrowth of confusion. The truth was that I did not wish others to witness this. The gap between my daily stage show of I'm fine and these hidden, underwatered, undernourished roots was becoming untenable. And still I conspired not to let daylight in. Yet around me, daylight was pouring in through the vigorous cascading canopy, and each leaf seemed to say, "This is the only way." The path led me into a gradual peacefulness, a dispossessing humour and treacle-thick tiredness. I asked at the desk to stay, and I agreed the financial transaction with a total lack of commitment, making sure that there was a roof and cool liquid in the room. I would have my purchased solitude. I could smell the ocean. I took my few belongings with me along a winding path. I admit to becoming vaguely intrigued, though I believed that I had not paid for an adventure. By now my face was melting like candle wax, a product of the mixture of heat and grueling humidity, this forest's mysterious and rudimentary elixir. I arrived at a wooden house standing on its own. Inside there was a sense of velvet created by the closed curtains, a fine, dappled complexion. It coated everything. I wasn't sure whether, in my state, I wanted to let light in. However, my inquisitive nature took over, and I finally drew back the thick drapes. It was as if all the sides to my world collapsed, and intense light poured in. Before me, as if painted onto the glass by some master's hand, was an expanse of white sand pushing out from the framing trees, pushing the restless sea back. The beauty, like incense, seemed to rise up into the open air and immediately overrule any of my meagre human senses. The sheer intensity of it shook me to my root. The beach was deserted. This whole world was enclosed within itself, tense with iridescence, bathed by the sun. It was a perfectly seamless joining of individual threads, the scattered bougainvillea pinks creating a patchwork, the fish-eagle unconsciously scanning and diving to take the ocean's bait, a piece of driftwood stained white and pointing upwards, all of of them in the same second, every detail rising up into vision, causing the most subtlest of colour fusions and blends. I was involuntarily drawn into all of it, this intricate and constant motion without end, this pulsation of life, this untamable animation. It captured me completely. There was the single hanging, spiny durian fruit rocking like a ship's lantern, sulphur butterflies clustering on citrus, the pungent, spicy breath of the sea. And out on the wood-stained veranda, a chorus of insects calling rapturously to the unending open sky, and then to me. I saw them all, and each in their infinitesimal part, immediately and instantaneously, I soaked each and every one of them fully in. It was a simple thing to see this vast orchestration naturally coming together, in formation and yet also gradually unfurling. I do not know how long I stood, only that that was how it must be. I was utterly displaced, without thinking, stepping out of time's clothing and its habitual and casual hold. I settled, as instantaneously as morning moisture does on a leaf. In response, I took off sticky clothes and replaced them with a white shirt. It was right, for none of this conventional jewellery fitted. It was my act of recognition. There was a stone bench under a fragrant tree heavy with fruit. It was a place of composure and reflection, and I decided to occupy it. A monkey left as I came, disturbed and sulky, yielding yet knowing the place to be his. I was comforted by the shade before the temperamental tides. I could taste droplets of salt water on the hot breeze. I was lulled by the dance of the distant tree fringes, shading the rock outcrops with faint colours. Here is where I played out my long, unopened questions as if each was a lover's request. I laid out my stained tablecloth of thoughts, feelings and beliefs. Or perhaps it was laid out for me. Or, in truth, all was blown carelessly open, being only a flimsy man-made weave. It wasn't hard just to let go and surrender. As I sat, my intention was not to search for treasures. However, they came to me, and I somehow became drawn in. The fusion of them into my quietness and watching was inexplicable, all and one part of the same pulse and movement, leading and being led. All and one. All and one. The gentle rocking of it all. I was being cradled. To one side was a community of miniature crabs feeding at the edge of their salt lake, separated from the ocean by a fateful strip of raised sand. This was their entire world, their land a splinter of stagnating liquid cast over a dividing bank. The swallowtail butterflies pushed by the light breeze and courted the spiralling vanilla vines. They fed at a pinhead blossom appearing just opened and an inviting shade of pubescent pink. Then the unsteady lizard who seemed to need more from the sun than it generously gave. When I first saw him, he was chewing at a mouthful of struggling crab taken whole, captured not from the speed or hunting skill, only because of a lazy grab and the excessive numbers of food options scattered about him. The process of digestion was equally exaggerated, forcing the vents of his throat into dislocation so that he could finally take in his prey. Beneath my feet, the antennae-fine appendages of salt-starch shell expelled for the day from the mouth of white froth. Along with it was a spray of other carvings, amber and pearl, ochre and purple, each a perfectly formed jewel. Each set out with delicate precision, each an intricate part of this tapestry. Not a single one could ever be out of place. Each of them was a line on this great, wondrous face of this world unto itself. The evening brought another orchestration, not different to the day, but as a scherzo is to an allegro, as if the build-up of sound could no longer be subdued or contained. The music spilled over into everything, so that no individual note could be discerned. This music was like rain in its natural way, deeply soothing. It was a tumultuous orchestration, and yet, with any one piece missing, the wind, the trees, the sea, it would have been nothing. How can I possibly explain the sense of immense precision by which this little world existed and turned, always just on the cusp of balance and on the edge of chaos? All of it overflowing with life and its constant ebb and flow movement without knowing a beginning or end. And I was a speck, yet so much connected, blending into their kingdom, none of the normal judgments fitted. I was distracted. I was away, and yet somehow finely woven in. I was detached and free-falling, willingly undone, at last freed and set sail from my human longings. Peace had found me, taken me as a bird would its flight. I had settled. At last I had discovered one precious piece of my own complicated jigsaw, and in doing so, all the rest had fallen into place. I had fallen into my natural rhythm, been startled into my place. All was now as it is. As it is. The sunset was a watering of the parched earth, and colours were rising into blossom, pushing away reason, mixing brown with reds in blatant artistic treason. How well the tree outline survived the plagiarism, and the eagle still hunted, changing colour by the second, yet unheeding the change and never losing focus. And the sea caught the dripping of colours from the sky, this melting, this waning back into calm and cool. The constant swell took these remarkable brushstrokes as if it were cleaning a canvas, returning it to something unstained, untouchable. In the end, I was taken by a kind of fear, though in truth it was more like a humbling. I was unable to bear the vermilion, then the ripening into crimson, unable to stop my head from lowering under the weight of it all as the massive strokes of final colour fell away to be eradicated by night. So night enveloped the beach, and me, and all of what remained of my day. I was a grain, and yet so full of this pulse. It was as if I had been brought to this moment. Yet I was no longer broken. In these darkened shadings of peace there was absolute clarity, and I cast my mind back, remembering the long day before this, the long day of my life before this. Remembering this defended way of human living, this life that in its ways barricaded me in, keeping myself apart and unyielding, tethering me behind my resistances. These things I had come to call me. They seemed as important now as a feather on the wave's edge, to be instantly set to sea. Then my life this day, this beauteous day, unfolding and finding home just in the flow and being amongst all of the movement. I could not even raise a hand or assert my presence, and it wasn't necessary. I had been taken somehow. It was nothing like the human tendency to be in control. I sat where I was and allowed all that was happening simply to work upon me, work with me. No, work through me. Some time later, I noticed my tiredness was slipping into a gentle exhaustion. Perhaps it was because this glorious day was finally coming to an end, and I was inextricably bound up in all that it was, all that it had been. I have to say I was also bereft. It was hard to know a day of this much beauty, only to have to witness its end. I was like the child in his bed, unwilling to sleep after just one story. And here was I, one who in a single day had come to believe in fairy tales. So much in a day. Then something else happened. Just before the last sigh of evening gave way to night, I was standing and looking out. All was as it is, and I was part of an intense stillness. Suddenly all fell into a calm, as soft as the sand was between my toes. It was a perfect stillness, and I was suspended, simply held and caressed by it. All my senses seemed to be taken to the edge of their alertness, as if I was ready somehow to read any subtle or minute movement. My seeing was intent and focused, yet relaxed. My hearing, my smell, my taste. Then it happened. A breath of air moved through me. Yes, through me. It was as if I was met by the most tender of touches, and all of my body and heart responded with a quivering movement of energy. The touch signaled to me an intelligence. Yes, a sense that I was not, and never had been alone. That I had and always was interwoven into this mysterious living world. All that is seen and all that is invisible, I whispered to myself. Then another gentle outbreath of air came stroking the silence. Again I was deeply moved, stirred within as if I had somehow been gently provoked into receiving a blessing. I heard myself say, I am alive.
A world unto itself. I don't want to say much about this piece, but what I do want to point to is how it touched me. The experience was like being lifted out of an imprisonment. I talk in the piece about settling like moisture does on a leaf. And it was completely like that. It came unaware and it arrived, but it was a sense of being freed from some sort of imprisonment, involuntarily being drawn in to this constant motion, this untamable animation. And it was a different time, space experience, because everything was in ebb and flow, all in one, intimately woven in to everything that was going on. And when I think about the piece and the ocean, it's all in one, the simple rocking of it all. I think the lines in the piece were, I was cradled. And there's something else, when that experience came, it was like being remembered. It had been forgotten, once known. It was like an echo from the past for me. It was a very moving experience, but again, to the theme of these experiences, towards the end of the day, I felt bereft that it was ending and felt like a child who had to go to sleep having been read just one story. But there was a bereft moment. And this is the moment when these experiences go and they leave us on the pavement of life, wondering how to integrate and respond and find our way with these kind of experiences. When I think of this experience, I have an eternal print of it. I can vividly remember it right now. And yet at the same time, there is this loss, the crack in the wall closes, the box closes, and we're left with the taste of it. I wonder if you want to say anything about this, Anne.
I think this is an important piece to remember, Adrian, because pre the experience happening, you were in a difficult place. That's what I'm hearing. You were searching, you were seeking, you were hungry, you needed drink, you needed water, you needed nourishment. And you didn't know that it was going to happen. You didn't know what you were going to find as you went on that journey. And when the experience happens, it can be like it's something I've been longing for. It's something I know, but have forgotten that I know. You described it as being held, being cradled. So it's hard, really hard to step back from that. And sometimes there's a need to hang on to it. Mm-hmm. And life can become a bit mundane when we bring ourselves back from it. But I think the ongoing work is, how do I bring that experience that touched me so deeply, that awoke something in me? How do I bring it back and really find ways to manifest it in my life? How can I allow it to inform what directions and what choices I might make? And I think that time for integration is really important. That after having these sorts of experiences, we're kind to ourselves. We're not super critical of ourselves, because sometimes things that mattered to you before won't look the same anymore. Mm. And it can get confusing. And you can start asking yourself, well, what do I really want now? This is what I thought I wanted, but everything looks slightly different.
And when you began, Anne, when you introduced yourself, you were talking about how these moments of awakening, these glimpses, these experiences have actually transformed your life. So even though they're difficult and even though there's a struggle with them, I really want to underscore the transforming nature of them. And it brings up a question I want to ask you, Anne, about might you speak to being part of the whole and how it's affected your life and work?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, if I share a little bit of the experience that first awoke me, it's over 40 years ago now, but it was a time of having to survive. And I had more than survived. I had the beautiful home, I had 2 children, I had a loving partner. And yet over a course of maybe about a year, things began to feel arid and dry and pointless. And it was quite shocking. And I didn't at that time know where to look or to seek support or help. These experiences weren't spoken about in the same way as they are now. And one morning I was putting my dustbins out, and it was a September morning, one of these lovely mornings where it's warm but you can breathe and the light is beautiful colours. And suddenly I just got this insight that I needed to really change the direction and my thinking about myself and who I was in my life. And that it might mean me having to take risks, maybe stepping out of the known, because I was a suburban housewife, and a suburban housewife didn't talk about these sort of things. But what it awoke me to was deciding that I needed to look for an education, a training. And I chose in that moment to commit to finding a vehicle to train as a psychotherapist. But I knew that I didn't want to be purely a psychoanalytical psychotherapist. I needed to find something that could speak a bit of this language, that could speak a bit of the spiritual nature of who we are. So that moment has directed possibly the rest of my life, because that's what I did. I went on and trained as a psychospiritual psychotherapist, and the moments haven't ceased. There's been several turns of the spiral where I've had the same sort of feeling that things have become dry and arid again, and there's like an irritant inside that's saying, Anne, listen, waken up, listen. And I've had to stop and have the courage to think, what is it that I'm not listening to here, that I need to pay attention to? What is it that's trying to emerge for me now?
So a very fundamental impact on your life and in shaping your life and your contribution as well in life.
Yes. Yes, because at that time, I didn't have the words a will to service or an experience of being part of a whole. I didn't have any of that language. I had the language of probably, being very, very alone and feeling different and feeling quite isolated.
For me, Anne, I really hear the journey for you. In my life and work, it had real impact over time as well. But there are subtle impacts and small micro impacts, and then very, very large ones as well, just like you. But the overarching thing for me about these experiences is a care for life, a care for my own life, and a care for others' lives as well. And I remember how I treated people and how I sat with them and how I met them became different. Even the way I met myself, there was less why me questions and more what for. In this system, in this life, in this world, what's this about? What's this for? And I remember, to give you a small example, and the listeners a small example, sitting in a traffic jam one day. And I remember, instead of asking the question, just me in the car, in the traffic jam, I want to get home, I looked at the people and I thought, just like me, they're just like me. We're all trying to get home. And it gave rise into an open-heartedness and a warmth and a kindness and a sensitivity to what it means to be human. And so it helped me respect and support difference and stay with people listening as a fellow traveler. I also listened in a different way. I listened for what was emerging and what was more than. It wasn't my speed of life and pace of life changed, and I wondered a lot more. I stayed open a lot more. And the biggest thing of all was it began to give me, like you, Anne, a sense of meaningfulness or being part of this system in this world. I wondered what my contribution might be in my vocation and my service, and that began to unfold too. I began to have a sense of, almost I'd call it an accountability and responsibility to have upon, to really deeply wish to offer out rather than just have, and to give. And so, I've pondered this a lot for this podcast. And again, these small glimpses have had very expansive impact in my life.
Adrian, I think you haven't used the words there, but I think you're alluding to them. I think that being with the experience enables us to open to enormous compassion and self-love. And that compassion and self-love means that as we are curious and look at the world around us, we also have much deeper compassion and love for others. And I don't mean being in love. I'm meaning that we have a sensitivity to what may be happening for others. That means that our work becomes more of a vocation. So initially we might work to live, but I think that many of us that go on this wilderness journey, it isn't just for ourselves. I think it turns that working to live around to living to do this work, because it comes with enormous privilege.
It makes me think of a word I discovered at the time of my traveling called Maitri. And Maitri means unconditional friendliness with oneself. And it was a word that I nurtured and kept and wondered about and tried to nurture in me, this unconditional friendliness with myself, not running away, not rejecting, just being with. And that extended, that respect, regard, extended. And so you made me think of that word, Anne. I want to ask you another question. What is the gift then of these experiences, if you were to summarize it for people?
Well, the gift for me has been that I have a much, much clearer sense of purpose as to why I'm here and meaning in my life. And that was really important for me. that question of meaning, what's it about, was a question that haunted me all my life, I think from the moment I was born. But I think that having that experience and responding to it and continuing to listen means that I can ask myself, when I'm about to make choices, what meaning does this have for me? What is it that this is offering? And not just for me now, but for others as well. You know, what meaning? And it's funny, I lived in the Far East for a while. And at the time, I had begun this journey, but in some ways put it on hold while I was out in the Far East. And the only place I could go was to meet with a group of old Indian ladies who didn't speak any English, but they cooked food, Indian food, and we sat together once a week in Kowloon, actually, in Hong Kong. And it was something in their presence that soothed me. But they gave me a name and they called me Atma. And Atma means peaceful soul in their language. And it was like being bequeathed the quality of that. But I think that that's been part of my purpose. If I think a lot of the work I do is to attempt to live from a peaceful soul and to attempt to enable others to touch into that in themselves.
Lovely. I have a sense of coming home and belonging, Anne, in what you've said. That's what I hear. It may not have been your experience, but I have that real sense of having a place, having a part of something and being part of the whole. And for me, the gift of the piece is a build on that as well. It's an invitation to a more awake, aware life, a road less traveled. When I was on my trip into Langkawi, when I wrote A World Unto Itself, I was escaping from my language of I'm fine and trying to sort out my circuitry. Well, what I invite us to is a life where we challenge ourselves and open to a life of questions and risks and seeking to stay with what we don't understand and try to sense the meaning and the reality of things around us, not the surety and certainty of logic and rationale alone, not a comfortable and controlled life. I want to invite people onto that path, and the wilderness path is that. The other thing I really want to say is that this potential lies within all of us to be awoken, to be stirred for self-discovery and for growth. And it's in everyone. And these experiences are a natural and real part of the path. And so I really want to mention that because they can feel like they're otherworldly. And I can only speak to my experience, but very much like crystals in rock, they came to me small, very brief, and in this one instance, longer. And when we prepare the soil and welcome them, then they arrive. These are the gifts for me of this core theme and these pieces. And we were talking about this piece about staying open on the pavement of life and integrating these experiences. So we said we would include one more piece, which is called When the Winds Come. Do you want to say a few words about that before we play it?
Yes, it's a lovely title, When the Winds Come. And I think that's the piece that you're talking about, Adrian, when you say stay awake, stay alert. Yeah. It's so easy to slip into what I would call unconscious living. But when the winds come, it's an opportunity for growth. And sometimes when the winds come, initially it can come through maybe moments of crisis. I'm not talking about major crisis, but moments of you being stopped in your tracks. And you can either try and get back to normal, or you can stop and listen. And for what am I being disturbed in this way right now? What's the message here for me? What might this be about? So when the winds come is an invitation, I think, to stop and listen at these different turns of what I would call our life spirals.
when the winds come.
When the winds come. When the winds come, you will know, blowing not within branches, amongst leaves, but through you. Touching only that emptiness which cannot otherwise be touched, because it is away on the inside. Close your eyes when the winds are coming, or else you might believe that only the leaves can feel them. When the winds come, tears will still rain onto the dry soil, seeds scattered and ridden, leaf moulded, life forbidden. All the salt water will spill, only to gather again and fill up in the print marks on the clay of this human life cycle, its overturning cup, until we are willing to go into the emptiness as the winds do, only to know what flowing is. Look up when the winds come, and gratefully let them in. You cannot know otherwise that your flesh walls are paper thin. And wonder why they might be sent, and whose great breath is bent on filling you. So surrender when the winds come, begin to make amends, because they hold the possibility of our willingness to bend. And remember, when the winds come, they are a sender. Open your sails, become sycamore within the wind's care. Does it matter how far you are taken now that you are travelling, or to where when the winds blow, when knowing seems too much a complication, an extra layer? And that there is eternity somewhere in the vast expansiveness between now and there. So be silent when the winds come, and bear your longing, for in truth, within their song, is your belonging.
And to close this piece, I invited you to bring a quotation that would be fitting to this core theme. Would you share your quote with us, please?
Yes, I'd be delighted. And it's from a little book called The Magic of Herbs and Flowers. And I actually found this book, or it found me, over 40 years ago. And I hadn't really looked at it. And this is a bit like When the Winds Come. It jumped off the shelf to me when you invited me to do this piece with you, Adrian. So I opened the page, and it's a piece by C.J. Jung. And it says, "The living spirit grows and even outgrows its earlier forms of expression. It freely chooses the men in whom it lives and who proclaim it. This living spirit is eternally renewed and pursues its goal in manifold, inconceivable ways throughout the history of mankind. Measured against it, the names and forms which men have given it mean little enough. They are only the changing leaves and the blossoms on the stem of the eternal tree."
Beautiful, Anne, beautiful. Changing leaves and blossoms. So my quote is similar to Anne's in the way that I had one pre-planned. And a couple of days ago, I went back to my journal of when I wrote these pieces, and this quote was in the journal. So it seems fitting. It's a quote from Einstein, and it also seems fitting that a scientist should comment about something that is mysterious and intangible. And he writes, "A human being is part of the whole called by us universe, a part limited in time and space. He experiences himself, his thoughts and feelings as something separate from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of consciousness." I'm going to repeat that line, a kind of optical delusion of consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few persons nearest to us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion, to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. So thank you, listeners, for joining us on this unusual, challenging, mysterious, and very rich topic. I want to thank Anne very much for being part of this. Anne, do you have some final words as we say goodbye?
I just wish everyone well on their journey, because the journey will continue. And I hope it brings us, and all of us, much joy and compassion and love.
Thank you. I underscore what Anne says. Thank you for your time, and we'll speak again soon.
A massive thanks to Anne and Adrian for guiding us through and making accessible a topic which is not easy to tackle. Also, thank you for your listening, and I wish you well until we meet again next time. And as always, Adrian would have me remind you that each conscious step counts.